Let me go ahead and introduce, I'm going to sit down. Our next session, which is our New Testament contributions to the topic of hospitality and immigration. I'm grateful for our paper presenter, Professor Juliet Lambert Fogg. The Reverend Dr. Juliet Lambert Fogg holds the William and Darlene Carlson Endowed Chair for Youth and Family Ministry at California Lutheran University, where she has taught for over 20 years. A scholar of the New Testament, she teaches and mentors undergraduates in the CLU Religion Department and has taught for many years at the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in the Theological Education for Emerging Ministries program. Dr. Fogg specializes in the Pauline letters, first century Christianity, theology from the margins, border-crossing narratives, and cross-cultural reading practices. Dr. Fogg's current book project focuses on St. Paul's strategy for community building among diverse and divided communities, which is strongly reflected in the paper that she'll be presenting here. Her most recent article, A Neurocognitive Approach Reveals Paul's Embodied Emotional Strategies, was published with the Journal of Religions and offers a preview of that work. Dr. Fogg's first book, Finding Jesus at the Border, Opening Our Hearts to the Stories of Our Immigrant Neighbors, released in 2020, sets the stories of contemporary immigrants in conversation with gospel narratives at Jesus' border crossing. In her public service scholarship, Dr. Fogg writes for theworkingpreacher.org in Espanol, the Vocation Matters teaching blog for the Council of Independent Colleges, among others. She has served as a part-time pastor at Messias Lutheran Church in Pasadena and has worked for Farm Worker and Food Justice with the Abundant Table in Ventura County. And our respondent is Professor Jorden Ryan from Wheaton College. Dr. Jorden J. Cruz Ryan currently serves as the Associate Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. He hails from the multicultural city of Toronto, beautiful city in Canada, where he grew up in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world. Dr. Ryan is a Tusoy Canadian, meaning that he is of mixed Filipino descent, and much of his current academic work is focused on biblical interpretation, one for and from the Filipino-American and Filipino-Canadian diaspora. Dr. Ryan's research also involves the study of the New Testament in light of its archaeological background, and he serves as the head of Roman period research for the Tel Shimron archaeological excavation project in Galilee, where he has been excavating the remains of a Roman period Galilean village. He is the author of a Filipino-American commentary on Acts in the well-known The New Testament in Color commentary by InterVarsity Press, as well as a monograph, The Role of the Synagogue in the Aims of Jesus, and the book From the Passion to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Could we give a warm welcome to our paper presenter and our respondent? And now Reverend Dr. Fogg is going to come up and present a paper. Let me pull up the title here. Practicing the Mind of Christ, Dispositions and Habits of Hospitality with Immigrants.
Good morning. All right, I'm going to set my timer because that would be important. First, I just want to thank Nathan and Max and Laura, especially for all of her work, Dean Dennis Edwards and Dean Hannah Andre, and the rest of you who are here. It's really good to be here in such amazing company with folks who are thinking about some really important and difficult issues. I'm really glad we're coming at them from so many directions. I think that's what immigration really needs. So thank you for that. Okay. Immigration discussions today guarantee a really fraught set of issues. Not just the thorny texts that Denny Carroll was talking about, but thorny contexts, right, that we're all living in. These really thorny contexts are dividing our communities, right? We all feel that. Christian and non-Christian communities alike. Hospitality, in contrast, feels like a pretty safe place to stand, right? It's a straightforward topic. But then the questions of how and with whom we practice hospitality become just as fraught and divisive. Although Paul does not address immigration per se in his letters, he does write about practices of hospitality in the context of these thorny issues, and especially with divided first-generation Christian congregations. In Paul's letters, hospitality includes welcoming friends and strangers, sending and receiving, sharing meals, and accompanying those who suffer in prison. When churches practice hospitality, and Paul assumes that they're practicing hospitality, Paul urges them to embody and cultivate very specific internal dispositions or attitudes toward the world. Psychologists call these internal dispositions prosocial emotions. Philosophers call them virtues. Paul simply calls these dispositions the mind of Christ. For example, Paul tells the Philippians in 2:1-5 that sharing the mind of Christ means having the same love, being of one spirit and one mind, doing nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility, valuing others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you looking to the interests of others. That's his definition of humility, looking to the interests of others. Paul exemplifies this practice of humility in his letters, consistently demonstrating concern for the needs of his team, his companions in mission, his churches, all over his own preferences and his own privilege. Paul also exhorts first-generation Christians to imitate me as I imitate Christ. Why practice humility and looking to the interests of others? Because Paul says, and he reminds the Philippians of this, as they exercise in 2:13, as they exercise katergatsiste, the mind of Christ, God is the one who is working among them. So this you work, God works in you, among you. And the work God is doing in their work, their practices, their dispositions, is to heal social divisions, rebuild fractured communities in deep times of suffering, and to pull the body of Christ together. Okay. Practicing the mind of Christ by embodying humility and love is not for the conflict averse, so put your seatbelts on. It's not for the self-righteous among us. In fact, while Paul is primarily concerned with creating, healing, and sustaining Christian community, he argues that Christians are called to embody the dispositions of the mind of Christ in all of our actions and with all of our neighbors, maybe even those Christians that you wouldn't call Christian. Whether those neighbors agree with us ideologically, theologically, politically, culturally, or not. So in my paper, and this is a much revised version, better for me to speak it to you, I argue that to practice hospitality as Christians, we have to embody this humility. We have to embody this love that looks to the needs of others, that is the mind of Christ. We have to embody it to each other as we practice hospitality with immigrants today, and as we practice hospitality in our divided nation, in our communities, in our congregations. When Christians practice and embody Christ's mind with all of our neighbors, regardless of citizenship, social or economic status, regardless of identity labels, God is at work in us to transform our local neighborhoods and cities into a community of care for our nation as a whole. In my first book, Finding Jesus at the Border, I wrote about my experience as a professor with DACA students, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, from Korea, from Mexico, from many places. As a pastor accompanying undocumented people in a Pasadena church near Altadena, where the fires have devastated the communities, folks there lost homes, and in Ventura County with farmers and farm workers, many of whom experienced that difficult situation that Danny Carroll talked about, where Ruth has to decide whether to lie down with the overseer or not. That's happening today. I set the gospel narratives of Jesus' border crossing side by side with the stories of undocumented people and myself crossing borders, right? Getting outside of my comfort zone to develop an ethic of border crossing. So in that book, I'm arguing that we need to get out of our sociocultural comfort zones, even our political comfort zones, and start practicing the kinds of risks and vulnerabilities that Jesus and our immigrant neighbors demonstrate when they cross borders. And Jesus crossed a lot of borders. In other words, we need to practice crossing cultural, political status borders that divide us in our neighborhoods and engage one another in welcoming, hospitable ways. I believe that cultivating the mind of Christ and the dispositions of Christ will help us do that work. But let me first dispel a couple myths about immigration. I'll give you my context. So I'm coming to you here in snowy Cook County, did I get that right? From the farmlands of Ventura County, where in 2022, my county ranked 16th in the United States for agricultural food production, 13th for vegetables, potatoes, and melons, 8th in grains, beans, and peas, 4th in berries. You're welcome. I didn't do the work. But I guarantee if you've had a strawberry, I've been to those strawberry farms. You open a Driscoll's box, those little plastic, we call them clamshell thingies. Yeah, the last people to touch those strawberries are the farm workers who don't speak Spanish or English. They speak Mixtec, they speak Nahuatl, they speak many other languages that are indigenous to Latin America. Okay. According to my colleague, economist Jamshid Demouy, in his 2024 study, about 15,000 undocumented immigrant farmhands in Ventura County, 15,000, are responsible for producing this food, your food, our nation's food. Last year alone, the 60,000 total undocumented Ventureños in my county, they're just 7% of our population in the county, they produced 5.4 billion of our county's overall economy. Their direct impact on Ventura's economy also generated over 16,000 additional jobs in the county. In terms of county taxes, undocumented immigrants contributed $1.9 billion in 2024, of which $824 million went to the federal government, who is now sending ICE and deportation teams into our communities to frighten our neighbors. So, of the undocumented people in my county that are producing so much for us, 77% have lived in the US for over 10 years. 28% have lived there longer than 20 years. Families are of mixed status, so of those 60,000 undocumented people, 23,000, they have 23,000 citizen children in my county. These families are predominantly renters by about 80%. 20% of my undocumented neighbors live below the poverty line, yet they're producing billions of dollars for the county. 5% live in abject poverty, that is, live below half of the federal poverty line, which is, 10, 20 years behind actual livability numbers. So, why do I say this? To dispel the myths, which you are all familiar with, undocumented immigrants do pay taxes. Their presence can create jobs. They generate economic well-being. And They receive less than they give. So, why practices and dispositions in my title there? That's my only slide, and Nathan did that for me, or Laura did that for me. Why practices and dispositions? Well, Professor Carroll talked about the formative power of narrative, and we had some conversation about the formal power of ritual, formative power of ritual. So I'm going to talk about the formative power of practice. I use terms of practice and habit fairly interchangeably, but here's essentially what I mean. A practice is a habit that we intentionally cultivate. So you do a habit when you brush your teeth, you intentionally walk 10,000 steps a day. I don't know, right? You plan that out. It becomes habitual, but it's intentional. It's a practice, okay? Practices can be repeated habits of the body. So we move our physical being, that's behavioral. They can also be dispositional habits. That's affective. That's what you feel. Now you think, see, I'm doing this, I'm gesturing at my chest. You think that your feelings are here in your emotion because you feel them in your gut, they get tightened up in your neck, or they release things when you feel good. But actually, it's your cognitive system engaging with your nervous system. And the nervous system runs throughout your body. It's in your gut. Yeah, it is. It's in every part of us. So this affect or these emotions, these dispositions, are run by your cognitive mind when we choose to activate and practice something. And you may have like an immediate reaction, oh my gosh, I'm afraid, I see a shadow across the floor, it's dark at night, woo. And you have a reaction of fear. Now, you can choose sometimes to stay in that fear and be like, and just let your mind create more and more fear scenarios. If you have PTSD, your brain's going to do that on its own. Okay, so there is a non-choice element of this. But for most of us, when we're cultivating a practice of affect, have you ever practiced gratitude? Christians know this. We give thanks in prayer. We're practicing gratitude. The mindfulness movement is just catching up to us, right? So you know what I'm talking about. We're practicing that giving thanks, these emotions of mind and heart. When we intentionally and regularly cultivate these specific behaviors and attitudes, the practices form our habitus, right? Our habit, our habitus. This habitus is the dispositional home out of which we live, our default setting in response to the world. It's a mindset that controls our attitudes towards neighbor and self and world, okay? We're cultivating character, we're cultivating attitude, we're cultivating practice in the world and being with one another. In the last 20 years, science caught up to what Paul and the philosophers knew, and the research fields of neurocognition and behavioral psychology are confirming what people have practiced for thousands of years. I'm going to skip this part because I think I just talked you through it. All right. Why are these practices important, and why practice them with everyone in the acts of hospitality that you'll be hearing about at the symposium? As I mentioned, we know we're divided. We feel it deeply. It sets off our nervous system. We get fearful. We don't know how to engage people. We start to shut down. Those of you who I have undergraduate students, those of you who work with undergraduates and maybe even seminarians today, all of us after COVID, I think, our nervous systems are off, right? We get angry faster, we get upset faster, we get tearful more quickly. The littlest thing can bother us, the microaggressions pile on, and it's just overwhelming. Okay, that's our nervous system telling us we need something different. If you magnify this to the whole nation, we're losing our capacity to engage with anyone who has political identities or identities other than our own. We're afraid to cross these borders of difference, so we start avoiding the divisions and disagreements and confrontations. What are we doing? We're practicing avoidance. You see? We have developed a default habitus that seeks a smaller and smaller homogeneous social group where we feel safe, familiar, a secure microculture. Now, I'm not saying don't ever feel safe. Please, always feel safe. Have a space where you feel safe. But if we only stay in that safe space and we don't stretch our own engagement borders and boundaries, it will keep us from working, bless you, with our fellow citizens and from following the biblical call to care for all of our neighbors. Paul offers the solution of the mind of Christ. So let me try and walk you through a selection of texts from Philippians and Corinthians, and I've added Thessalonians to the selection. Paul reflects on the mind of Christ in Philippians, and it goes a little bit like this. Have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who in being very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his advantage. He was not going to benefit from that privilege, but gave it up, made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. That's a social role change. That's a cosmic role change. That's divesting yourself of the prestige of how you present in the cosmos and taking a different form that presents as very low in the social hierarchy, right? Made in human likeness. For the ancients, human is the opposite of divine, right? It's limited, it's messy, it's not comfortable. By being found in appearance as a man, he then humbled himself. And taprephosune, this is the same Greek word that Paul is using throughout Philippians. By becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Death on a cross is reserved for a slave. Okay? So taking the slave form and then the ultimate death of that form. Paul interprets this hymn as the realization of a mindset or disposition and attitude that Christ enacted in the world. With humility, Christ sets his mind on becoming human and slave and relinquishes the divine title, position, and role. Paul follows suit. He leaves home, relinquishes titles and prestige and valued community roles, as a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee, a righteous keeper of the law. He gave that up. He determines to follow Christ. He becomes an itinerant migrant, entering cities as a stranger and working as a day laborer. Now, in the ancient world, we hear a lot about Paul was a Roman citizen, blah, blah, blah. They didn't imprison Roman citizens. Okay? Scholarship is starting to shift on this. Did Paul really have citizenship? Actually, what mattered in the circles that he was moving around was the polis citizenship. So when he talks to Philippians, the Philippians are feeling left out because their city, after an earthquake, was rebuilt by Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers got citizenship of the polis. And the Philippians, who were living there, got displaced. They were no longer citizens. That's why Paul talks to them about citizenship in heaven. He's offering them an alternative anchoring space, okay? Now, Paul was not a citizen of Philippi or Thessalonica or Corinth or any of these places he goes to as a stranger, okay? So he becomes a migrant, and with humility towards his own status and position, he risks deportation. Well, they called it expulsion from the city. But he's banned from multiple cities for disturbing the social order. He's banned from Philippi. He gets thrown out of Thessalonica. And the problem is he's been disrupting the local economy by his labor, and he's disrupting the social order
by his preaching. Disrupt the economy, disrupt the social order, and now they don't want you. Okay? Paul can relinquish titles and roles and further cross cultural and political borders because the only culture that he clings to is Christ. And the only politics that matter to him is our citizenship in heaven. Paul cares very little about the values or virtues attached to mundane social identities. He refers to it as people-pleasing distractions, empty boasting. It's a total loss in Philippians. It's not unusual that he would put on and take off these identities as he's preaching, right? In Corinthians 9, he says, I am free with respect to all, but I will limit myself, self-limit, and be a servant, a slave. To the Jews, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became one under the law, though I am not under the law. To those outside the law, I became one outside the law. Outside the law are folks who are undocumented. Paul says, I became like that. Might be a parallel in our life today. To the weak, I became weak. Who wants to be weak? Nobody wants to be weak. Nobody in Corinth wanted to be weak. They were all striving to be strong. Spiritual strength, bodily strength, they wanted it all. Paul says, no, it's overrated. Give that up. You are banking on that. You should be banking on Christ. The way Paul becomes all things to all people is precisely by relinquishing these social and religious roles, refusing to claim any identity for its value and prestige. I will get to hospitality, I promise. Paul's move to practice considering everything a loss comes precisely from Christ's own practice of humility. But there's another side to this humility, the one that we talked about, looking to the needs and concerns of others. He tells the Philippians, as we saw, do nothing out of selfish ambition. Oh wait, claim your title, selfish ambition. Posit your identity over someone else's, selfish ambition, right? Valuing maybe your theology and principles over someone else's. That's going to be a stretch for folks here, I know. But if we're sharing the table of Christ, Paul will have a solution for that in a little bit. All right, we'll let our minds rest on that in a minute. Not looking to your own interests, he says, but looking to the interests of others for the building up of the body of Christ. That's the measure. All right, so let's look at three scenarios. So I promised you Thessalonians, Philippians, and Corinthians. Let me see if I can get to them all. The first one, Thessalonians, I added in because Paul is leaving Philippi, where he's been kicked out because he disrupted the economy and the social order. So they kick him out of Philippi. He and his team, Paul, Silvanus, Timothy folks, go 65 miles. That's nothing compared to other immigrants today. They walk 65 miles east. He says they suffered greatly and were treated outrageously in Philippi. And in Thessalonica, what do you think they do? They go to the marketplace. Why do you go to the marketplace? Because it's like Home Depot. At least where I'm from. Home Depot is where you go. What? Okay, 5 minutes. Home Depot is where you go if you're looking for employment. If you're looking for day labor, right? How do you make that connection? Construction. People are coming, they're buying the wood, they're buying the nails, they're going to build something. So Paul goes there. It's the ancient urban agora is like the Home Depot, the bustling hive. Day labor is not Paul's preferred occupation. He's a teacher, he's a Pharisee. He digs that. You get a lot of kudos for teaching, right? Well, sometimes. Depends on your students, right? He says, you remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not be a burden to you. Why are immigrants working in our country? Because they want to pull their own weight. And we don't want to do those jobs. And I guarantee y'all aren't prepared to pick strawberries or move around the country and uproot your kids from their schools. So Paul is offering us a way of thinking about hospitality where he goes into a place as a stranger and they receive him. He praises the Thessalonians, their hospitality to him before they even became Christians, becomes well known throughout Achaia and Macedonia. They welcomed him. They fed him, they offered him shelter, and they said, come and work side by side with us. They took a risk. They took a risk with that. Max, may I quickly do Corinthians? All right. So the problem of the opportunity of hospitality, of sharing meals. In Corinth, everybody lives, there's no privacy. Everybody's living in every kind of combination in tenant houses that are made of wood, and they just sort of hang wool blankets and separate this person from that person. So there isn't any really private worship space, right? There's believers and non-believers mixing together in the tenant houses where people are worshiping. And they want to have the different congregations around Corinth have a meal together. But for the Corinthians, who are very divided anyway, because they like to boast about their status and their prestige over and against one another, their different way of being Christian, following Apollos or Paul or Christ, which way are you going to be Christian? They want to come together and have a meal together, but there's a problem because some are getting drunk and some are going home hungry. How does that happen? Well, you could say that the day laborers get off later than the folks who have a 9 to 5. That's one way scholars have looked at this. You could say, well, the host of it is very proud to host and so brings out all of the loveliest treats and sets them at the head of the table, and then as the platters go down the table, there's less and less left until there's only bread by the time it gets to the end. Why do they do that? Because they're living Greek culture. That's how you did it. You put the host at the front, you put the guests at the front and the most prestigious people, but you're not sharing the whole meal. So Paul says, forget about it. Eat in your own homes. That's his solution, a compromise. When the congregations come together and offer one another hospitality, and they're divided about how to do things, they're divided economically, they're divided by status, okay, then let's do this a different way. We're going to come together, and when we come together, it's to eat the Lord's Supper. And if you need to eat at home or have your glass of wine before dinner, do that at home. He's not presupposing hunger on anyone's part. These people aren't hungry. They're just doing things according to status in their culture. In this way, he says, when you compromise and you invoke humility and you practice humility about your own rights to have the lobster instead of the bread, then what you can do is actually come together as a community and work together. So those are two scenarios that we might look to for ways that Paul is practicing the mind of Christ, inviting Corinthians and looking at Thessalonians, practicing the mind of Christ in humility towards others, taking risks to invite people to come together, working side by side, and within a divided congregational community. So, thank you.
Wonderful. We are now going to have a respondent from Jorden Ryan, Wheaton College. And let me just address those who are online. If you would like to join us in the chat discussion, please go directly to the YouTube streaming site that's linked to our webpage. And in the chat box, there will be a moderator that will field your questions. So those of you who are online, if you'd like to ask questions during our Q&A, you can through the chat box on YouTube. And without further ado, Professor Ryan, please give us your response.
Yeah, it's good to be here. And just a quick shout out to I know that I have students and colleagues at Wheaton College who are all streaming this and having a panel discussion around it. So I just want to say hi. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. So Dr. Fogg's paper does a commendable job of highlighting the practice of hospitality in 1 Corinthians and Philippians, and now also 1 Thessalonians, which is awesome. So situating the conversation in connection to humility, imprisonment, and to cultivating habits directs us to ways in which those of us who read Paul's letters as scripture in the 21st century might then recontextualize the Pauline concept of hospitality in our own contexts. And I particularly appreciate, and I'm glad you got to talk about this, the consideration of the material conditions of migrants in the Roman world, because that helps us to humanize migrants both past and present. So in general, I find Dr. Fogg's interpretation to be helpful and persuasive. Nevertheless, due to my own situatedness and my own social location, I personally, and I want to highlight the personally part, find the conception of hospitality to be alienating as a model for Christian engagement with immigration. And that's not to say that I disagree with it or I think that it's problematic or wrong. It is a model, however, that I find difficult to identify with and to appropriate. This is because hospitality is primarily a posture adopted by the perceived citizen or resident to the perceived foreigner. Thus, it presumes the positionality of power in the relationship between citizen and foreigner. And as much as we might say that the foreigner or migrant participates in hospitality by receiving it, the reality is that they are ultimately the object and not the subject of the practice. And I'm not a citizen of this country. In fact, I had to drive a full 3 hours to the border from Toronto when I first came here. And although I am Canadian and have gone through the... And by the way, I just came back from Toronto recently, and I want to highlight for us the fact that back in Toronto, they're very afraid right now of American empire. And the conversation there around what's going on here, understand that talking about Canada's 51st state is not a joke to us at all. That is empire. I've held, as a Canadian, 3 different work statuses in the US. TN, H-1B, and now PR, and it took 6 years before I attained my green card through that process. My point is that I am a resident but not a citizen of this nation. And even if I was a citizen, I would still be, and this is, I think, crucial, a perpetual foreigner due to the racialization of Asian Americans in this country. So, my mixed Asian features and brown skin ensure that I'll always be regarded in some way as foreign, and perpetual foreignness makes it difficult for me to relate fully to exhortations of hospitality because, whether rightly or wrongly, I'm routinely perceived and racialized as someone who should be receiving rather than giving hospitality. And I have another reservation about hospitality in the context of the US and Canada, and this is because I wonder if it fails to recognize the fact that most Americans and Canadians are settlers. So as settlers, what right do we have to deny or welcome others to land that is not our own? And how does indigeneity play into a theology, biblical or otherwise, of hospitality? Do we, in other words, extend hospitality at the expense of the original inhabitants of this land? And can we decolonize a theology of hospitality? So in the remainder of my response, I'd like to explore these texts and contexts from below, from the positionality of the migrant and foreigner, and from my own social location as a member of the Filipino diaspora and descendant of a people who experienced 5 centuries of colonization. I also hope to provide some perspective from my disciplinary expertise in archaeology, and the background of the New Testament. And for the sake of time, I'm going to just focus on Corinth and 1 Corinthians. The Jewish diaspora in Corinth, which is nicely described in Acts 18, 1-4, would have necessarily been a migrant and settler community living in a Roman colony with a distinct cultural and linguistic hierarchy. The archaeological evidence of inscriptions, meaning where inscriptions are found, shows that Latin was a prestige language used in the city center in the public inscriptions in that core, but that Greek, a language indigenous to the region and much more commonly spoken in the Roman East, was more commonly used in graffiti and in inscriptions in private houses. Paul's Corinth was a Roman colony founded in 44 BCE on the ruins of a Greek city that had stood against Roman expansion into Greece and was razed to the ground. The archaeology of inscriptions in Corinth shows that the Roman colony had a cultural hierarchy with Latin language and its accompanying culture, the culture of the colonizing empire, as a prestige culture and the culture of power, and Greek, the indigenous language and culture beneath it. And so a minor suggestion that I'd have for Dr. Fogg's paper is that it might be helpful to consider Ekaputra Tupamahu's work on heteroglossia, meaning the diversity of languages at Corinth. So Tupamahu makes a really strong case for understanding the famous passages about speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians in light of Corinth's multilingual milieu. He shows that languages other than Greek and Latin were also a part of Corinth's society, as he highlights literary and material evidence for Jews who spoke Hebrew, as well as Egyptians and Lycian communities in Corinth, just to name a few. And so although it's a popular assumption that when Paul writes about tongues in 1 Corinthians, he must be talking about ecstatic speech rather than actual languages, Paul specifically uses the term heteroglossia, literally meaning speaking in another language, in a translated citation from Isaiah in 1 Corinthians 14:21, which indicates that he is addressing the issue of people speaking in actual languages that others in the congregation don't understand. This is Tupamahu's argument, at least. So coincidentally, this suggests that the Corinthian church included not only Jews and Greeks, but perhaps a diverse group of immigrants of various origins. And so something that I like to say about Pauline studies is confining our understanding of ethnic diversity in the ancient church to Jews and Greeks is the black-white binary of biblical studies, blinding us to broader realities. There's more reason to believe that the Corinthian church included immigrants because it included slaves. They're mentioned a number of times. We're not accustomed to thinking of slaves as migrants, but enslavement and sale at markets in the Roman world is surely forced migration. Our reticence to think of them as migrants renders them and their cultures invisible while downplaying the realities of migrant labor exploitation through enslavement. Slavery is perhaps the most significant factor in migration in the Roman Empire. The major source of newly enslaved people who would have been brought to markets at trading cities like Corinth was people who were displaced, dominated, or captured in war. Slaves were thus typically forced migrants, and even people born into slavery were thus often second or third generation immigrants. By the way, there's this idea in this country that slavery is over, but I just want to say it's not over for Southeast Asian migrants. Our people are incredibly vulnerable to this, as all the studies show. This is work that my wife does in her research. David Noy's study of immigration in Rome has shown, on the basis of funerary inscriptions, that the largest groups of immigrants to that city, that is Rome, by far were soldiers and slaves. Of civilian foreigners at Rome attested in funerary inscriptions, about 36% were enslaved, ex-slaves, or likely enslaved. This is remarkable, given that slaves were much less likely than free people to have the means to purchase an inscribed funerary monument. War and slave labor, a type of labor that is necessarily exploitative, were thus driving factors for migration. State violence, war, and political instability were causes of simultaneous mass enslavement, mass dispossession, mass migration, and mass displacement throughout the Roman world. This is bread and butter for those of us that work in archaeology in the Roman East. Labor and economics were also major factors in the migration of free people. In Tractate Avodah Zarah, the Tosefta, a person should not go abroad unless wheat sells at the price of 2 seahs for a selah. That is about double what it should cost. So this is food scarcity. This assumes that the primary reason to willingly immigrate from the Jewish homeland is food scarcity, and the ruling considers it the only legitimate reason. Paul himself, as Dr. Fogg talks about, was a free migrant worker. He writes to the Corinthians of growing weary from the work of our hands, and in 1 Thessalonians, he reminds the Thessalonians that he worked night and day while among them. Upper-class Roman society famously viewed foreigners with disdain, particularly conquered peoples who were uncivilized barbarians. The dominant Greco-Roman theory of race, and yes, that has a whole area of study in classics, was based on geography and environment. Rome was at the center of the world, and its people were thus perfectly balanced, designed to rule the world, in the words of Pliny and Vitruvius and many others. The further out one was from that center, the less well-formed a people was. Foreignness was racialized as inferior in Roman culture. By contrast, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians proclaims to the reader that although Christ crucified is a scandal to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, the crucified Christ is in fact the power and wisdom of God. The tortured and shamefully executed Messiah, a man of a people group regarded by Roman elites as Cicero as born slaves, or as Tacitus says, as a depraved, base, and abominable perpetual other, a man executed by imperial authority is in fact the power and wisdom of God. This means, for Paul, that God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. I've shown that migrants in the Roman world, whether by foreignness, economic need, or enslavement, are people who would unfortunately have been considered to be weak, foolish, or low and despised. Yet the Pauline epistles invite the reader to adopt a very different worldview, one in which the weak shame the strong, as evidenced by the power of the cross. The practical upshot of citizenship in Christ's kingdom is the need for complete reordering of our social hierarchy, such that diaspora, indigenous or settler, slave or free, are all baptized into one body, a body in which those members of the body we think less honorable we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, since God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member. I suggest that means that we are called not just to welcome migrants, who are often those that ancient society and our society would view as less than or inferior, but completely reorder our social hierarchy such that we clothe them with the greater honor. So to conclude, to those that continue to mistreat or exploit migrants in our own world, migrants like my own Lola, my grandmother, my mother, I end with the words of James, who gives voice to the cry of a diaspora community of migrants. James 1:1, it's to the diaspora, who are also apparently laborers. Because he says, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. God hears the cries of exploited laborers, and I urge us to join them in their cry for justice. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent response. So now we're inviting questions from those who are here in the room on the floor, but also to those who are online. If you have a question online, please do type that into the chat, and then someone will read your question here on the floor for our presenter and our respondent to address. First question.
Here, I'll bring them. As you're thinking, I do know we have some students in a course here as a parallel course, so we'd love to hear from students as well, right? I'll put them on the spot.
I'll take the bait, Dr. Clayton. My name is Cara. I'm a student here at NPTS. Thank you so much, Dr. Fogg and Dr. Ryan, for your work, your research, your presentation. Dr. Ryan, I'm curious to hear more. You mentioned that you didn't view hospitality as a helpful framework for talking about the topic of immigration. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share more or elaborate on what you feel is a more appropriate framework.
Yeah, so it's not so much that I don't see it as helpful, it's that it's hard for me. And the reason is basically what I said, that the perception, at least of what hospitality is that it's something that others extend to people like me. What I think, and it's difficult, I think, to think of exactly what that framework looks like, but I like to think of the reordering of society, which is such a common theme throughout the New Testament, right? It's central to all the teachings of Jesus, the idea of what the kingdom of God is, this reordering of society. And we see it there in Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, for example. That, to me, I think, is an underutilized element of the conversation about how we should think about those that our society thinks of at the bottom. It's interesting to me that we think about a lot of those passages as like, well, that's about the poor, whoever they are, rather than about all those who are marginalized. Because I think what we see, part of it has to do with the fact that we separate out slaves from migrants as well when we read the New Testament. When the reality is that people who are on the bottom of society are often, by necessity, captured from somewhere else and brought to be slaves. And in that case, they're absolutely forced migrants. That's how I've been thinking about it. Again, not that I think that hospitality is not helpful or useful. It's hard for me to relate to. I think that's maybe a better way to phrase it.
Thank you.
Could I ask Dr. Fogg to respond to, because in her longer paper, she talks about a sense of role reversal. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to hand the phone off, but I think, I'm wondering if a model of mutual hospitality might be a decolonizing move, and I would let Dr. Fogg speak to that.
Well, I thought the decolonization that you were offering us is so critical, and I too have found difficulties with hospitality. I served a bilingual church in Pasadena, Messiah Messias Lutheran Church. I'm not Lutheran, I'm Presbyterian, but I teach at a Lutheran school. I have learned the Lutheran heart for education and for people and diversity. Lutherans are amazing hosts. They don't know how to be guests. So in this bicultural, actually it was multicultural because our Spanish speakers came from all over the continent of South America and Mexico and the US. So anyway, so multicultural, and the Lutherans who were hosting, they organized the coffee, they organized the this, they organized the that, and then they were like, well, why don't they join the council, and why don't they, there was always an us-them conversation. And I wanted to say, but have you been to our quinceañeras? I've only been with them for 4 months, but they invited me for tamales. You've been with them for 30, 40 years. I'm sure they've invited you. So the problem that I saw, at least on the ground with hospitality, was the us, them, and this reciprocity that Max is offering in hospitality. I think it gets into the kingdom language. You got to flip the host and the guest. And this is what I mean by practicing border crossing. Oh, you're comfortable being a host? Let me get you to practice being a guest. Get invited over to some stranger's house, and let you worry about whether you take your shoes off or not before you walk in the door. Let you worry about whether the women should be chatting in the kitchen and the men in the living room. Let you figure out what the gender dynamics and the social dynamics and the expectations are. Let you have to say, no, no, please no more, and then have to eat more. Or as I did in Guatemala, eat meat when I was vegetarian because that's what the women had to offer. And there were no men in the village because they'd all been killed. So you eat what's put in front of you. You learn how to be a guest. I've gone on way too long, but that's some of the reciprocity that's a great word. Thank you.
Other questions?
My name is Mark, and thanks, first of all, for both the paper as well as the response. I was really fascinated by the conversation about kind of polis and citizenship, as well as kind of how hospitality is understood, from the vantage point or gaze of the citizen versus the the perceived stranger or guest. So my question is really for both the presenter and the respondent, if you want to elaborate on how do you understand and unpack Paul's social location, and does that alleviate some of this kind of tension with the theology of hospitality, or and I'll just leave it there. But how would you unpack Paul's social location?
I'll probably do it in a little bit of a different way. So, okay, yeah, sure. For me, and this, so I'll take a very specific approach, I think, and that is what I'm interested in. This is me coming. So I'm not a Paul scholar. I'm really a Gospels and archaeology person, which means my students know I dig in the dirt and talk about Jesus. So, but I have written a commentary on Acts. And one of the things that I'm really interested in Acts that comes out about Paul is there's this frequent racialization of him as foreign, and this assumption, and again, this isn't about the historical Paul, this is about Paul in Acts, this assumption that because he is foreign, he is not a citizen. And so this happens a number of times where he's arrested, and the assumption is that he cannot be a citizen because of who he is. So when I look at some of those narratives in Acts about his social location, on the one hand, he has privilege. He's somehow able to travel. He's able, he's free, which is a huge privilege in the Roman world. There's estimates that place enslaved peoples at 30% of the Roman population of the Roman Empire. So, I mean, he's certainly not like absolutely low status, but the thing that I think has always been missing from the conversation about Paul's social location is the fact that there is a Roman concept of race. And I think that his foreignness often trumps some of the privileges that he has. And that, at least in the way that he's portrayed in Acts, comes out. But again, the letter's different.
I think one of the things that, thinking about hospitality with respect to the Pauline letters, and I chose what scholars agree as authentic letters, right? So to get more at the historical Paul. Thinking about hospitality with Paul really helped me to see that actually, just like Jesus, Paul is guesting all the time. He's the one being received by the Thessalonians. He's the one being received and supported by the Philippians. He's the one not quite being received by the Corinthians when he says difficult things. He's the one being supported in prison for breaking the law. What was the law? He disrupted the economy and the society. I didn't talk about the prison situation, but they throw you in a cave or they put you underground. Paul is not under house arrest as Luke has him, in Paul's own words. He's abused. If we look into ancient prison systems, and there's a lot of work that's been done on this, he would have been chained to a guard and at the whims of the guard. If you get a sadistic guard, it's going to be rough. If you get a compassionate guard, he might listen to your stories about Jesus, right? And then the followers are coming and bringing help to Paul in prison. So what can churches do? You can be the Philippians. You can go to detention centers during visiting hours and sit with people who have no relatives nearby and pray with them for an hour or listen to them for an hour. And this kind of accompaniment is really important and missing from, I think, what a lot of our churches are trying to do. So I think it needs to be unpacked a lot more. I really appreciate the question. And Paul's social construction is really critical for both the interpretation of the letters and for Luke's own presentation of it. But certainly the archaeological work helps us do a lot of that. Other narratives in the ancient world help us do that. Does that help a little?
I would just add a quick comment that Ronald Hawk, he studied the progymnasmata, which are school book exercises for the person who's had a classic Greek or Roman education. He places Paul in the upper 10 to 7 or 8% of the literate in the entire Roman Empire, based on the quality of his letters. So what I found as an interesting dynamic is that Paul seems to leverage privilege, and we take his Roman citizenship seriously. He leverages privilege to love one's neighbor, to love the other, but he also relinquishes privilege to love one's neighbor. So he doesn't seem to think much about his credentialing, and he just either relinquishes or exercises, but not for himself, for others, and that might get to some of the questions you have about his location. Is there another question from the group or online? Do we have any online questions? Can I? No.
Yes. Hi. Yes, I am Ruth Melconian Hoover, and thank you for the paper and the response. Julia, I appreciated this discussion, and I was thinking about this same question of Paul kind of both leveraging and relinquishing his status. And so I wondered, in the same way that you said Paul, he takes on and practices joy and suffering, what are ways in which he does leverage his citizenship for the sake of justice or for a hearing at the same time that he's willing to relinquish it in humility?
I don't think he's a citizen. I don't think he's a Roman citizen. Paul is very good about boasting about his credentials in order to give them up and to demonstrate that giving them up. He never says he's a citizen. That comes to us as a literary move from Acts, I think. But Dr. Ryan will correct me, I'm sure. So, and that's what I mean. Scholarship is sort of swinging in that direction. Pauline scholarship is sort of moving in that direction. I don't think he's a citizen. Yeah, like I said, he would have listed it in his list of, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, I speak Hebrew, I am a scholar, I'm a Pharisee, I am a this. It's all crap. And he uses a stronger word. It's all crap when compared with Christ. He would have listed Roman citizen, I think. But, you know, that's my supposition. Yeah, I was talking with folks in the shuttle on the way over, and it's in my paper. I didn't talk about it today because I always run out of time. But the balance of pain and joy, the balance of suffering and joy that he's getting at in Philippians. If you look at other letters of Christians and others who have been imprisoned, Bonhoeffer, a lot of folks in South Africa, other folks around the globe who have been imprisoned, who maybe haven't published a book after, they all talk about the small joys of, oh, the water was warm for my tea when it arrived, or I could see a little bit of the sun coming through at this time of the day, and I rejoice in that. When you're in that kind of deep suffering in prison, neurocognitively, the pain-pleasure balance, it's a seesaw, we get into that in my paper. The greater your suffering, the more capacity you have for joy. Now that's a weird way the brain is made up and the nervous system is made up, but it's there, okay? So, and your brain will self-correct. So if you are super rejoicing, or if you're an addict and you have a super high, your brain is going to correct and add some pain in there somehow. For the addict, it's the headache you get when you didn't have your coffee in the morning at the right time, okay? That's your brain correcting for the pain-pleasure principle. So what I think is happening, Paul conceives of Christians as the body of Christ. We know neurologically today, in the last 20 years, that the brain works this way between pain and pleasure. Call it suffering and joy. When Paul talks about the body of Christ, what I think he's talking about is this neurocognitive balance that is possible when we as a collective and a community that works together, one of our members is suffering, others are rejoicing, and we can balance out the neurological shared system of our collective Christ body. Right? So I'm not sure if I'm saying that very well, but Paul talks about it as, I'm suffering in prison, but even though there are preachers outside of my jail cell trying to inflict more suffering on me, there are others who are supporting me. That's great. I rejoice. And you're like, you rejoice in being suffering? Your suffering's increasing? No, I rejoice because the gospel is being spread. I look to the concerns of others, the concerns of Christ, and that's where I find my joy. It doesn't matter what my suffering is, so Philippians rejoice with me. And so part of their act of hospitality and accompaniment is to provide the balance of joy with him as they walk with him in his suffering. And they too are walking in suffering. They don't have all the resources they need. They're scrimping and saving to try and send Paul some help in prison. And Paul says, and I rejoice with you in your suffering from your compatriots who are giving you trouble. So that balance of the neurological system of the body of Christ is really important. And that's why I don't like seeing our Christian communities working separately. I wish there were a way to bring the body together to work together in that way.
I have just one really small thing to add about citizenship, and this again, whatever we think about the historical Paul, it's at least relevant for the Paul of Acts, which is that, so Roman citizens are technically not supposed to be imprisoned and certainly not supposed to be crucified, but what is really interesting is that there's a number of sources, Cicero, for example, talks about this. There's a number of occasions where Roman citizens absolutely are imprisoned and even are crucified, but it's almost always, I've noticed, in the provinces, which means that, here's what's going on. These are conquered peoples who get Roman citizenship in various different ways. It's usually through serving in the military, but they're, for some reason, still not subject to actually all of the rights that citizens would be in, say, Latium or in Italy or even in a place closer to there. So this tends to be in places like North Africa and Hispania. So the reason why I think this is really interesting is there's always this foreignness that comes with people who are not at the center. And this is part of Roman ideology. And I think that that is important for understanding, there is citizenship in this country and in my home country, but there is still foreignness even for people who are born citizens if they're not perceived to be from here. So for example, people yell things at me from cars all the time. This is what I call drive-by racism, where they'll yell, "Go back where you came from." And I like to think, yeah, it'd be nice to go back to Toronto. It's just a 3-hour drive, but they're not thinking of Toronto, right? They're thinking of somewhere else. And so doesn't matter how I speak, doesn't matter how I present, none of that matters. It's the idea, the perception of who is and who isn't actually guaranteed the benefits of citizenship. And it's interesting, that goes all the way back to the Roman world.
Yes, we have a question from our own Dean Edwards.
Thank you. My name is Dennis. I'm here at the seminary. I'm trying to struggle with the question, but Dr. Fogg, you started out talking about humility. That's something I wrote on, so that's why it was triggering for me to think about that. And I guess the question, well, I wrote it this way, and maybe it'll make sense. I said, what does humility mean for those already humiliated and marginalized and who feel unsafe just by existing? Because we talked about, you mentioned something about taking the risk to be in spaces where people might be thinking differently and such. But there are places where I feel physically unsafe just showing up. And I think Jorden just touched on something like that kind of shouts you get uninvited. But what does humility mean? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. It's really important, and I so appreciate it. For those who are online and just listening to the audio, I'm white, female, I'm pretty tall, I have a PhD, I have a pastorate. I can walk into spaces and, even if I'm uncomfortable, usually I'm safe. Now, in a dark alley at night, whatever, my husband gets upset if I go there. But, right? So a lot of my experience and my audience, frankly, are people that look like me. So white congregations or Anglo congregations, folks that are well established in who they are and need a little stretching. Other folks don't need stretching. They've been stretched. They need to have some safe spaces where they can unstretch. What do I mean by humility? So there's a new book out by a psychologist, behavioral psychologist, cognitive psychologist, and I'll have the titles in my paper, and I won't remember it now, but it's on humility. He describes humility or humbleness versus humiliation. So humiliation is what the Romans were doing to other people to enslave them and take them out of their land and make them go to work, right? That's humiliation. It's externally imposed on you. It is a dominant force over you. Humility, and it gets a bad rap for us in our context too, so I apologize for not defining it better. Humility is your internal choice. Nobody can impose humility on you. right? It's me saying, oh no, after you, right? Or me saying, I'm going to read this text out of a different social location than I usually do. It's taking your own posture and intentionally saying, I'm not going to use my title today. I'm not going to get out of that police ticket or whatever it is. I don't know. But it's that kind of work which we can all practice. And it may be important, Dean Edwards, in certain contexts, for you to go in with all of your prestige because you need that protection or other people need to grow a little and meet someone like yourself who has these achievements and has so much to teach them, right? So I think it's a very contextual question and probably a social location question as well. But maybe those definitions help a little.
That's good, and for some reason I have the mic in my hand. But anyway, I'm just saying, thank you. I'm resonating with you. If I pushed a little bit, I would say those who have been humiliated are often the best exemplars of what humility looks like. Yeah. So anyway, thanks.
The conversation's been wonderful, but we need to stop for the sake of time. Can we thank Dr. Fogg and Dr. Ryan for their contribution to our session?